seem to have lost my steering. What happened? Okay, looks like my bolt broke off. That's good. I like to have a weak spot in a servo saver. But wait, there's not a bolt broken off in there. It's completely missing. So it must have backed out. I guess I didn't Loctite it well enough. Oh! There's my spacer. I wonder if I can find my bolt. Probably not. Well, I only looked for about 45 seconds and I found the bolt right down here. There she is. I like these bolts. They're stainless steel Torx. So they're not cheap, but they're also disposable. There are quite a few ways to keep your nuts and bolts tight. On tiny RC cars, Threadlock is probably one of the best, but I will explain a couple others. The very first line of defense is torque should keep them in place, unless they're subject to a lot of vibrations, which they are. The problem with torque on tiny fasteners is it's hard to find accurate torque wrenches or torque screwdrivers. You would never use something this big. Or tiny torque screwdrivers that are accurate at a reasonable price and provide the tiny amount of torque we're looking at. Plus, in my experience, most companies don't publish torque specs, so you don't know what you're tightening to. And if you have a custom build, you're completely on your own. So make sure your bolts are tight, but not too tight. That's about all I can say. Now, there have been studies showing that when a person is tightening something by hand, even a professional mechanic, smaller bolts are usually over-torqued and bigger bolts are usually under-torqued. You're more likely to over-torque small fasteners on tiny cars, so take it easy. One of the very best methods is to have a backup nut. So anywhere you can put a nut in addition to your bolt, I always do it. Run a longer bolt and put a nut on the bottom. Like this. Belt and suspenders. Another okay approach is these tiny split washers. This washer has a tiny split in it, and that split makes it like a little spring that pushes on the bolt head. And these are pretty good for vibration. I like to use these on servos. They work pretty well, but I also use Loctite and always use a locking servo horn. Another good approach is nylock nuts. Now, these nuts have a little ring of nylon inside that's not threaded, so when the bolt goes through, it pushes into the nylon, and that nylon acts as a little grip that kind of holds onto the bolt. These are pretty good, but they're only good for 3 or 4 times. After that, the nylon gets stretched out and doesn't work anymore. So you need to have a big supply of these and replace them every couple of times when you remove them. There is another very exotic design called a Nord washer. And I don't think they make these in RC car sizes, but it's an interesting concept. I haven't worked with them personally. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, but I'm a little bit skeptical how well they work because they do rely on friction between the bolt head and the washer in order for the entire system to work. And if you've got friction sufficient to engage these ramps, you probably have enough friction to hold your bolt tight. Also, always buy high quality fasteners. I did this video here that's all about it. Most RC bolts that come stock are just junk. Toss them and start with fresh, rated and graded bolts from an industrial source. Personally, I always use Torx fasteners when I'm using fasteners this small. Now let's talk about liquid Loctite, or Threadlocker, which is probably the best way to keep your fasteners tight on tiny vehicles from 1/8 scale down to 24th scale. I've been using this brand right here recently. I think it's pronounced Hanera. It's about 1/3 the price of Loctite, and it works just the same. They even have the exact same colors as Loctite and the same numbers, so it's pretty easy to understand. Loctite generally comes in 3 colors: purple, blue, and red. Now there are actually dozens and dozens of different Loctite branded formulas, but for the most part, purple is low strength, blue is middle strength, and red is high strength. And it's not quite that simple, so I will give you some details. Now this brand, Genera, kind of has a packaging issue in my opinion, because if you look at these boxes, this is purple and it's actually red Loctite. This is blue in a red box, this is purple in a red box, and the only sign is this purple right here. So the boxes are totally inconsistent. The colors are down here, but the colors and numbers do correspond to Loctite. Now the bottles are also all blue and red, which I think is confusing. So you have to look down here on the threads: purple, blue, red. I actually like this brand Genera a little better than Loctite because the viscosity is kind of like blood and it's translucent. I just like that look and feel, whereas Loctite, this is essentially the same stuff, is kind of chalky and a little bit chunky. I just like the look and feel of this one better. As far as performance, they work very similar to Loctite. I actually think the purple Genera is a little bit stronger than Loctite's purple. Another thing to know is that Threadlocker is anaerobic, which means it only works when there's not oxygen. So the good thing is you can have this bottle wide open and it will never dry out. I've had this bottle of blue Loctite for probably 15 years, and it's still liquid. That's because oxygen doesn't affect it. It doesn't work until there's a lack of oxygen. So once you put it on the screw and you tighten the screw, that seals off the oxygen and then it cures. Otherwise, this will sit on your shelf open for many, many years. As a general rule, you want your fasteners to be clean and free of grease. One way to do it is wipe these off with alcohol or degreaser, but honestly, I never do it on RC cars. It doesn't seem to be totally necessary. The Loctite is strong enough. You can also buy primer if you've got a really mission-critical application, like you're building the space shuttle. I would probably degrease it and use primer to make sure it works. On a tiny RC toy, the Loctite by itself on the bolt is good enough. Bolts usually have an oil film on them from manufacturing and from shipping to keep them from rusting, so the best practice would be to clean that off. You can wipe it off with some alcohol or brake cleaner, degreaser, something more exotic if you want, but I find it's generally not necessary. Loctite does make oil-tolerant versions of some of their Threadlocker compounds. 243 is the blue medium version that does not require primer or cleaning. I could not find a low-strength purple version, and Genera doesn't specify if theirs is oil-tolerant or not. There are actually 3 variables that you need to consider when selecting the proper Threadlocker. One is the Threadlocker strength, low, medium, high. The second one is the size of the fastener. And the third one is how much you're going to apply to the threads. When I was a kid and I didn't know any better, I would just completely paint my threads like this. And sometimes I had a real hard time getting my bolts out. This is not the right way to do it. The proper way to do this is you really just need one drop, one very small drop. That is more than enough to hold your bolt tight. Now you could do a second drop if you think you need more, but usually this is the appropriate amount. There are basically 2 classes of Loctite, and I'm going to call it removable and permanent. Removable or non-removable. And when I say permanent or non-removable, it's not permanent, it's more semi-permanent. In addition to the strength of the adhesive, you need to consider that in relation to the size of the fastener. Small, medium, large, low strength, medium strength, high strength. One key consideration in selecting your thread locker is the bolt diameter. Over here we have the strength of the Loctite, whether it's purple, blue, red, low, medium, strong. And up here we have 3 different bolt diameter ranges: small, medium, and large. For bolts that are smaller than 5 millimeters, which is pretty much everything we use in scale RC from 8th scale down, purple, low strength, is appropriate. And it's considered removable, which means you can remove a fastener with normal hand tools. If you use a blue Loctite on a fastener that's smaller than 5 millimeters, it's considered semi-permanent, meaning to undo the fastener, you generally need to add heat to it to break the Loctite bond. Red should never be used on small fasteners. It's just too strong. For medium-sized fasteners, about 6 millimeters to 19 millimeters, purple just generally doesn't provide enough strength to be very effective. Blue is appropriate for a removable application, and red on medium-sized fasteners is considered semi-permanent, requiring heat to remove. On huge fasteners, 20 millimeters or bigger, 3/4 of an inch or bigger, purple and blue just aren't strong enough to make much of a difference, so you would always use red, and that's considered removable. If you're using a high-strength Loctite for the size of your fastener, you have to heat it up to break down the Loctite. And you can do that with either a heat gun, or, this doesn't work great, but a soldering iron. You can heat up the head of the bolt and get it to melt the Loctite, and it'll come free. So if you're using what would be considered semi-permanent or non-removable, you will generally need to use heat to get it out. Don't use Loctite on plastic parts, whether they're molded or 3D printed. Loctite will react with the plastic, and it usually makes it brittle and breaks it down. You shouldn't have to use Loctite on plastic because usually plastic parts are just a blind hole, and you force the threads into it, and the plastic will spring against it and hold it in place. If for some reason your holes are a little loose, I would just use your basic super glue. That's because most plastic-specific thread lockers are just a version of CY or cyanacrylite. It's basically super glue, and it won't super glue it in permanently. So if you do have a loose hole in plastic, just use some super glue. Thread locker is generally usable in 10 to 20 minutes and 24 hours for full cure. There's also an entirely other class of Loctite, generally called green retaining compound. This is very useful for keeping your bearings in place, and I'll discuss that in a different video. What the heck? I lost my steering again. Look at that, the bolt is actually walking out the top. I think I know what the problem is. This ball is completely bound up and not moving freely, and it's backing out everything it's attached to. So I figured out the problem. I had some rogue balls in my collection that were measuring closer to 6 millimeters in diameter, 5.9. And the spec is supposed to be about 5.8. And these were pushing 6 millimeters. And the difference is this. Look how tight that was going in. This is so tight. That's what was causing my servo horn screw to back out. It's just way too tight. Ideally, your balls are nice and free like this. Better to be on the loose side than on the tight side. Can't even move these by hand. Oh. This is so tight. I don't know how these got in there, but they are too tight. After putting in the correct size ball, I never had that servo horn loosen again.
Many months later.
Oh, dang. Better use better Loctite this time.